Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be painting this loose watercolor landscape. I'm going to be showing you simple techniques in making your landscape fun and interesting. I also have uploaded an extended real-time version of this painting over at Skillshare, which has additional exercises and tips. If you are interested, you can try Skillshare Premium free for 2 months and watch my classes there and other creative classes on there as well. Also, only the first 25 people can get to watch this class for free. No sign-ups needed for that. Again, all the links are linked in the description, so be sure to check them out. Alright, so once you've got your paper cut down, go ahead and tape the edges. I have cut my paper here to a 5 by 7 inch. I like to eyeball mine to like a thin border, but you can experiment with the thickness that you would like. But ideally, a 0.25 to a 0.5 inch is what most people go for. So for this section, I'm looking at my reference pic that I have just for inspiration and have that somewhat guide me as to what I want my landscape to look like, but I will be changing this up a lot as we move along. So for instance, I wanted my mountains to be much higher so that I can have more land to play with as opposed to having more sky in my reference pic. I'm adding a little section for a lake and breaking the landscape up that way. In the foreground, we will keep it quite simple with maybe some grass and a few details which will bring interest to the painting. I'm also quickly sketching out a few trees that we will have far away. But yeah, this sketching phase is very important. It does, simplify the process, and it gives you a good perspective as to where your painting is heading. Alright, so let's begin with the sky. I am using Prussian blue and burnt sienna to create this moody sky. Start with one straight wash at the top and then gradually thin it down slightly as you move downwards. You can also thin it down by dabbing your brush onto your paper towel and then adding that layer. So this will help sort of take off the excess pigment, and it will help lighten the color. So we started the painting by using the wet on dry technique, but so adding the extra layers on top of the sky would be considered the wet on wet technique. Jumping right into the mountains, I'm using cobalt green and Prussian blue to create a flat wash to the mountains. We're going to keep it really simple. Just create one flat wash and then we'll move on to the next step. We are going to be working on the first layer of trees wet on wet. So using some Prussian blue and some indigo, I am going to suggest some trees by the mountain. Also, you don't have to have this exact same combination of blues. In fact, any combination of dark blues or greens will be fine for this step. Now, since we are working on this wet on wet, the colors will bleed, which will create the illusion of distance, which is what we want, right? So we will also be adding in more trees on top of this later on, but this is just to have some misty background trees. So I'm very lightly dabbing the tip of my brush to create these tiny blobs. Using some golden yellow, I am very lightly adding a wash underneath the tree section, which is like this faraway land. I also wanted just a tiny bit of these yellow kind of orangey trees far away, so I'm also adding a few blobs of those trees as well. Again, the paper is still wet, so I'm able to use the wet on wet technique for this. I'm also intentionally leaving in some white spaces every now and then, so I would really advise you to do the same. So as you're painting, if you feel like you want to leave, you know, a few little streaks or gaps open, just do that. You can always fill them in later on if you don't like it, but just do it to leave some room for interpretation, and also it can add interest to your painting. I'm using some burnt sienna and a bit of that orangey yellow for the ground in the front. Play around with different directions to your brush marks as well. So I'm giving the foreground a few vertical strokes to make it a bit more playful and also to suggest some grass. I'm going back in with the cobalt green and some fawn green. Again, any dark greens will work for this step. I'm just adding in a few marks to the front to suggest some grass. So make sure your painting is completely dry before you move on to this next step. So I'm using a Prussian blue and cobalt green again. Again, any dark blues and greens will work. Even if you have ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, that will also work. So I'm going back in to add in some more details to the trees. Keep them suggestive, keep them loose and random. Again, the trick here is to be very light on your hand, and you'll know what I mean once you actually start painting. You really don't need that much pressure at all to make these shapes. So this is where I'm going to be switching my brush for a sec. I am using an old brush that I have to make these dry brush marks. So use any old brush that you have, or you could also make this brush by using any existing brush that you do not really care much of and twisting it like this. This will kind of make the bristles span out. So you don't want this brush to be too dry or too wet, somewhere in between, but more towards the dry side, so that you can get the dry brush effect to the trees like this. This just adds to a more natural, loose feel, but also provides for interesting brush marks to your painting. So I'm just using different sides to this brush to suggest some tree marks. Here I'm going back with the blue greens that we made, and I'm just creating very light wash of some of the trees in the back. Using that same color, I'm just adding some very thin, fine lines to the ground that is closest to the trees. Alright, so taking some acrylic white here, I'm adding some tiny specks and gaps to the trees and ground. This will help break up the shapes a bit and will add some more variety. When it comes to watercolors, these little fine details is what adds to your story and it keeps it more interesting. So by adding these tiny marks, you can suggest rocks, animals, houses, and you can just leave more room for interpretation, which is what can make your painting stand out. To get the reflection to the river, you want to get the same color you added to the trees and lightly add them to your water while you soften up the edges by moving your brush vertically. So basically you want to drag your brush downwards once you lay down your first initial color. Here I'm adding in some golden yellow to the foreground to add more value and also to build in some dimension. going back in and adding in some fine details. I'm darkening up the foreground closest to us with some burnt sienna and fawn green. Keep your marks loose and expressive to suggest movement of the grass. To make it a bit more expressive, I'm using some dark green, and I'm gonna be splashing a little bit of that paint to the foreground. So you can just do that by tapping your brush. That will give you that effect. And to protect your overall painting, if you don't want the splashes to go everywhere, you can just kind of make use of like a small piece of paper and just almost hide your painting from where you don't want the splashes to be. So this is a really fun step. This is where we carve into the paper by etching a few marks with our fingers. You can also use something pointy or a palette knife for this if you don't want to add use your fingers. But this really does add a lot of playfulness to the painting, and it creates movement. It's also very personal and literal because you can now see all the marks that the artist has left, and plus it creates really nice texture too. So quick note, this step can only work if your painting is a little wet. Once it's dried out, you will not be able to carve into your painting. Alright, so as we near the end, I switched to a fine detailed brush to add in some last minute fine details and marks. Make sure to not overdo it because it is very easy to get carried away in this stage, but just a little bit should do the trick. I also added in some fence to the foreground to add more interest and to break up that shape. I really hope you guys enjoyed today's painting, and if you would like to watch the extended real-time version of this, you can check me out on Skillshare. The links are mentioned below. Also, if you paint this, I would love to see it, so request to join my private Facebook group. Again, all the links are mentioned down below. And lastly, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and hit that like button if you enjoyed. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you guys next time.